I mentioned yesterday that in Latin, doctor means teacher. Grace Palmer came to us. I think, did we have an ad that we needed a scribe and assistant for me? The reason why she answered the ad was because her family were generational farmers here in Long Valley. Long Valley had two kinds of farmers. There were the farmers in the valley, and there were the farmers on the mountain. Her family were mountain farmers. When you look at the mountain over there, that ridge, there are farms on top of the ridge, and there are farms in the valley. Of course, the valley farmers had the best soil. And as a mountain farmer, her family, for many generations, because there were a lot of sugar maples up there, because it's a half a USDA zone colder up there on the plateau than it is here in the valley. So her family still to this day produces maple syrup, New Jersey maple syrup, like Vermont. And I was just telling Mary Berry yesterday, Long Valley is the southernmost point for the sugar maple in the east. They don't grow, and they can't grow south of here. The trees that you see around the medical office that were planted long ago, about when I was born, are sugar maples, and we're losing them because of the climate, because it's getting too warm now here. But the reason why I'm telling you this is, so she came from this family, and the family's remnants, although the children have moved away and the grandchildren moved away, the grandmother is still living up on that farm, on that mountain. And this granddaughter, whose grandfather was the physician for Eisenhower, played a major role in developing. He was one of the early gastroenterologists, because Eisenhower had suffered greatly from intestinal disorders. And he had his own gastroenterologist, and her grandfather was his gastroenterologist. And he was a teacher at my medical school, and he invented the endoscopy that looks down, the ones that we use today, that if you have a stomach ulcer, the doctor puts down the endoscopy and uses to diagnose your problem. It came from him. And so through these generations, from the medical school where he taught, to he taught my teachers, and now I am teaching her.
Yeah.
And she came here. She was trying to make a decision. Remember, Asha, should I take this job or should I stay in Philadelphia? Should I come home and she came back here and stayed with her grandmother and took care of her grandmother and came every day off the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
And came down here and learned how to be a physician. And then she was here for 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah. And the February before she left, she taught me how to tap these maple trees that surround the mountain.
We're not going there because there's a big story behind that. And we want to listen to Dr. Goldhamer. And I'm going there. And that's a beautiful story.
And with much trepidation, I tap these maples. And this is the point I'm trying to get to. Life is not black and white. There are many gray areas. Maple sugar is a pleasure trap. And I savored this maple sugar like nothing I had ever eaten. I made the native dish, which was the cornmeal from our blueberries from the Lenape, and I put this maple syrup on top of it. And I ate that. And then I stopped eating it.
I was just going to say.
That can be done, Dr. Goldhamer, as Dr. Goldhamer knows. It can only be done if you've gotten to the level of control where you can not do it anymore.
Yeah.
And so I took this maple syrup as sort of like a talisman, it was this relic that was so beautiful to me, and it enriched my life. And Thank you, Grace.
Yeah. Wow. We both really feel very grateful. So
She just texted me. She's in her third year of medical school at Dartmouth now. And she's going into all the rotations and is trying to figure out what kind of doctor she wants
to be.
One of the impressive things about these Ethos Farm Days are the extraordinary speakers that they are able to bring, share legends in this health movement. T. Colin Campbell was here. Joel Furman was here before that. Bob Quinn, Peter Singer, great people, difference makers. We have two great difference makers here this morning. And truly, I guess if you look at the mark of an individual or whose lives they can impact, our first speaker this morning has probably impacted more lives than anybody that I know. In fact, one of the great intersections when we do all our plant-based travel is that we wonder whether we insist that all our meals be SOS free. Well, that's a little, there's lots of vegans, but SOS, that's not. But the reason that that's really important is that so many of the people that travel with us, the intersection of the NHA and our plant-based travel is the True North Health Center. They've been to Dr. Alan Goldhamer, who is credited with inventing the idea of being SOS, the importance of being salt, oil, and sugar-free, the universal sign of distress, right? That's kind of where he came up with that. But it is something that was kind of at its time was kind of novel, but now it's become quite mainstream. Dr. Goldhamer is truly a legendary figure. It's been my privilege for my entire adult life to have known Alan. We kind of grew up together in the NHA. He's come to our conferences. I don't think he's missed one from what I remember for decades. He's a gifted presenter. He wrote a book called The Pleasure Trap that has a number of you, Ron just references. It's become almost part of the nomenclature now that you talk about people who can't get out of can't stop drinking, can't stop coffee. They're in the pleasure trap. That's the term that he and Doug Lyle invented in this book that they wrote, a couple of decades ago. It's amazing to me every time I was listening to a podcast that Alan suggested, Casey Means and somebody else, the Good Energy thing. They all talk about how these substances that we've have hijacked our brains. Why is it that we can't stop eating the pleasure trap foods? Alan and Doug identified that decades ago. It is still, as Ron says, when people come here, this is the book they ask them. It's one of those foundational books you got to read. It is a seminal book in our health movement. It, just like SOS has become kind of mainstream, so has the pleasure trap. He and Doug, we talk about that. He was way ahead of his time when he did this. But then, just recently, literally, the old thing about hot off the presses, can fasting save your life? One of the unique things about the National Health Association, the natural hygiene movement, is that we've championed not just a whole food plant-based diet since our founding in 1948, but uniquely the only organization in the world that has championed the benefits, the powerful benefits of water fasting, medically supervised water fasting. And there is no proponent in the world that has done more to advance that science than Dr. Goldhamer and his True North Health Center. There was a book written in 1964, published by the National Health Association, then called the American Natural Hygiene Society, called Fasting Can Save Your Life. It was an assertion that was done back then by Dr. Herbert Shelton, and it is the most popular book ever written on the subject of fasting until Dr. Goldhamer finally has come through with a book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? It raises the question, but we all know the answer. And anybody that's ever been to True North, you know the answer. It can. It does save your life. It does reboot your computer. It does. It's an amazing vehicle to reset your taste buds, to help you overcome the pleasure trap. The contributions that he's made, the number of people that have come through the True North Health Center in 40 years that people have gone through the doors of the True North Health Center and have regained their lives, regained control of their lives, overcome the pleasure trap. It's extraordinary, the contribution that this kind of humble, amazing guy. It is, again, my privilege that we've been friends and colleagues and soldiers in the same army for 40 years, every one of his 40 years. Dr. Alan Goldhamer.
So I do want to talk about this hidden force. It's an important force. It's not fully recognized. It's why people are fat, sick, and miserable. It's why most of the people you know are going to die prematurely. And it basically involves the artificial stimulation of dopamine in your brain. Dopamine is the neurochemical that is associated with pleasure. So it's there for a reason. Your brain has to make sure your body does the things it needs to get enough to eat, to not get eaten, and make sure you live long enough to reproduce and pass on your genes and start the whole process over and over again. The problem is it's possible to short-circuit that system. And chemicals like drugs are examples of that. So alcohol and methamphetamines and cocaine, and we recognize that people can get addicted to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in their brain, where when they stop taking those substances that they're taking to feel good, they now have to keep taking those substances to avoid feeling very bad. Kind of the hallmark of addiction is withdrawal. So that's fairly well recognized. What's not recognized fully is that there's also chemicals that can be put into feed, for example, that can also stimulate that same type of dopamine and result in systematic overeating. For example, if you give rodents ad libitum eating of their rat chow, they'll get to a certain size, then their satiety mechanisms kick in, and they'll stabilize. But if you put these chemicals in their feed, they'll gain 49% of their body weight in 60 days. Now, this is not psychological. This isn't because mommy rat didn't love them enough, or daddy rat loved them too much, or they had to go to work. It's biological. It's the artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain of the animal that leads to systematic overfeeding. It works in birds, too. In fact, if you give birds these chemicals, they'll get so fat they can no longer fly. Hardly an adaptive mechanism. And it also works in people. If you put the chemicals in the feed, people will overeat. They will systematically overeat, and they will gain weight. And the chemicals we're talking about are salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are not food. They're hyperconcentrated products taken out of food that are put back into food to make food taste better. Because that's what tasting better means. It means that whatever you're shoving in your mouth will stimulate more dopamine in your brain and induce more pleasure. The problem is when you overeat, you gain fat. And a percentage of that fat, around 10% on average, is what's called visceral fat. And visceral fat is the fat that accumulates around the organ, around the belly. And it's hypertrophic. It acts like a tumor. It gives off inflammatory products. It causes diseases like heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and cancer. Now, if you walked up to a person and said, look, you have a 2-pound tumor in your abdomen that's giving off inflammatory markers, they might think, well, that's not a good thing, and they might want to do something about it. That's exactly what's going on if you're maintaining extra fat. So to think of fat as being some kind of cosmetic problem, or maybe you won't fit in the right clothes or something, that's a very serious mistake. It's a major health risk factor. In fact, it's interesting, during our most recent pandemic, where people were dying from COVID-19, the one primary risk factor was overweight. How much visceral fat did you have in your body, which determined how well you responded to that and every other infectious disease. And yet it's not discussed publicly because it's considered politically incorrect to acknowledge that overweight is a contributing factor to ill health, even a major contributing factor, because that's blaming the victim. Salt, oil, and sugar, if you take a food like potatoes with 500 calories per pound and put salt, oil, and sugar in them, deep fried, now you get something called potato chips, have 2,500 calories a pound. You give the brain exposure to something with 2,500 calories a pound, and it says, tasty. And then you go back and try to feed it something that has 150 calories a pound, say like broccoli. So this has been such an effective system, this artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain, that actually, this slide was made a few weeks ago. It's out of date. The newest data suggests 74% of people now have achieved overweight or obesity. So that means if you're not overweight, you're abnormal. You don't want to be normal. You want to be healthy. Healthy people are not overweight. And if you're overweight or you're addicted to the pleasure trap, whether it's alcohol, drugs, caffeine, it is really difficult to escape. That's the reality. it's very hard for people to escape a pleasure trap. For example, if you're an alcoholic and you really want to quit drinking, and you go to an inpatient facility for 30 days and spend $40,000, and you go to 90 visits in 90 days to a 12-step program, and you have family support, the likelihood that you'll be drinking again within a year is 82%. If you're a heroin addict and the court mandates that you get sober and go to an inpatient program, the likelihood that you'll be using heroin again within a year is 90%. So there's a very high failure rate of trying to escape the pleasure trap from drugs. And most of us recognize it's not easy. But what about weight loss? The likelihood of you losing 5% of your weight using any of the conventionally available methods of weight loss, the chances are within a year you'll have a 95% failure rate. Which means the failure rate for losing weight is higher than the failure rate for heroin addiction. With drug addicts, we tell them largely the truth. What do we tell alcoholics? Do we tell them to just drink beer and wine? Put your alcohol in a smaller cup. Drink your alcohol with a spoon and put your spoon down before each slurp and you won't be a drunk anymore. Just don't drink after 5 p.m. Is that what we tell alcoholics? What do we tell alcoholics? Isn't that pretty radical? Isn't that a little extreme? Not drink at all? Yeah, well, we tell them the truth. You got to not drink that. You are not able to regulate the effect of that particular chemical on your brain chemistry. And if you drink, you'll find yourself unable to talk or move lying under the Golden Gate Bridge wondering how you got there. Probably naked. And yet, failure rates 82%, 90% on heroin. So it's still really hard, even telling them the truth. What do we tell overweight people? Eat less. Does that work? Put your food on a smaller plate. Put the fork down between each bite and you won't be overweight anymore. We lie to them. So if you lied to alcoholics and told them to just drink beer and wine, what would the failure rate be? It would be the same as it is for treating overweight people, which is if you have a BMI over 40 and the chance of you ever losing weight and keeping it off, for a male is 1 in 1,290. For a woman, it's 167, which means you have a 99.9% failure rate. It would be the same. It is. So it doesn't work using any of the available methodology that's told. Because we're basically telling people, keep eating the same ultra-processed foods with the same chemicals that are making you fat and sick, and just try to somehow don't eat as much of it. Or have the oil but don't have the sugar, have the sugar, don't have the oil, have the salt. Eat the meat but change the color from red to white. It doesn't matter. It all fails. We know that. Data is overwhelming. You've got millions of people that have tested it out. Now, does that mean that nobody can ever eat anything without becoming fat and sick? No. Can some people have a drink and not become a drunk? Yeah. But if you're a drunk, it's not you. Because if you coulda, you woulda. Does that mean some people couldn't occasionally have a little maple syrup and not gain overweight and become obese and have a problem? Sure. But if you're overweight, it's not you. Think about that, though. A heroin addict is more likely, statistically, to resolve their addiction than a person is to lose weight and keep it off. What percentage of Americans meet these 4 most basic fundamental health requirements? That is, they're active. Now, I didn't say they're an Olympic athlete. They just walk or bike or do some kind of activity on a regular basis. They don't smoke at all. They eat what's the American Cancer Society defines as a, quote, healthy diet, which isn't like what we're talking about here, but, eat some fruits and vegetables in the diet other than ketchup. More than the parsley that, sits on the plate. And if they're a male, they're less than 20% of their entire body is fat, and if they're a female, less than 25% fat. Now, that's not being heroin addict thin. We're just talking about what everybody would agree is, an appropriately lean structure. What percentage of Americans, if you talk 100 people off the street, how many of them would be doing those most basic habits. 2.7%. That means 97.3 are not. I always wondered, what does that 0.3 person look like? You ever wondered? So that means basically nobody eats meats, even though nobody you know probably, unless they're here. This is a map of the United States, and these are the self-reported levels of obesity. Now, this is not overweight. This is clinical obesity. That means if you're 5'4", you have to be at least 30 pounds overweight. So you notice the West Coast, you got around 35% obesity, and when you go east, it gets like more like 45%. A couple of these states there are getting really close to 50%. Home of deep-fried ice cream, Louisiana. This map is proof that the people at the CDC are what are called optimists. Because nobody's yet broken through and achieved the 50% much desired level of obesity saturation. But you notice they put it on the map there? Because they know any day, could have been today, one of those states is breaking through, and the majority of the people will be clinically obese finally. We'll have increased the strategic fat reserves to the point where when spring comes late, we'll be just fine. Now, this actually underreports obesity in the United States because it turns out these numbers are self-reported, and people lie. And they always lie saying that they're thinner than they are, and they never lie saying they're fatter than they are. And there's only one place in the entire United States that has obesity saturation below 25%, and that place is Washington, D.C., which means that the people that live in Washington, D.C. are the smallest overeaters or the biggest liars. So 93% of all the calories consumed in the United States is coming from meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar. 7% comes from fruits and vegetables, but a third of that are potatoes served mostly as French fries and potato chips. So fruits and vegetables are no longer a statistically significant percentage of the diet of most people living in the United States. They're the decoration on the plate. And as a consequence, we have leading causes of death, which include heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. And we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars waiting till people get heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, and then we treat them with bypass surgeries and stents and very expensive drugs, which unfortunately don't do a lot to reduce all-cause mortality and certainly don't improve the quality of people's lives largely. Instead of what I think we should be doing, which is treating the actual causes of death, the reasons why people get the leading causes of death. And the actual causes of death are smoking, drinking, and eating animal foods and highly processed, ultra-processed, refined carbohydrates. Now, if we spent more time getting rid of smoking, drinking, animal foods, and ultra-processed foods, we'd get rid of the reason people get the leading cause of death rather than waiting and treating them after the fact. But instead, what we do is we sell olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate and coconut anythings and diet sodas and white meats, and we ask people to go on dead Dr. Atkins' diet. May his full soul rest in peace. So the high protein, high fat, short-term gain, long-term nightmare type dietary approaches. What we should do, in my opinion, is adopt a whole natural food diet. So fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. As you heard, SOS stands for the International Symbol of Danger, and also for the chemicals put into food that make people fat, sick, and miserable. So let's eat a diet from whole plant foods. Let's get enough sleep. We suggest doing that by not eating 3 hours before you go to bed, so you have a period of between 8 and 12 hours of fasting every day, and engage in some regular exercise. What does a whole plant food diet look like? Fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. If you walk into a grocery store and you walk through the aisles, you find a few federally subsidized grains with salt, oil, and sugar in various concentrations with lots of chemicals. That's what makes up most of the grocery store. And then maybe in the back there's the loss leader where they have a bit of produce and stuff like that. I made a comment one time that 95% of the stuff in Whole Foods had nothing to do with Whole Foods. And the owner of Whole Foods at that time, before it got sold to Amazon, was at the center, and they said, that's not true. It's higher. More like 99%. And they said that it's because the people buying meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products, oil, salt, sugar, chocolate, alcohol, that there is a Whole Foods. That if you took away that, there would be no Whole Foods. So now when I go into Whole Foods or any other health food store and I see people filling their carts full of ultra-processed crap, I have a completely different attitude about it. I actually go over to them and thank them for their support. So for 200,000 years that modern humans have been present, we ate whole foods. And then about 200 years ago, during the Industrial Revolution, we began to change over to ultra-processed foods to the point where today 70% of calories come from stuff that looks like that. Now I want you to look at the next picture very carefully. And I want you to tell me, can you tell the difference? Okay, the difference is why we're fat, sick, and miserable. So what I'm suggesting, simplistically, is to change from eating the ultra-processed foods to eating the whole foods. It's hard to do that. As I said, escaping the pleasure trap, one of the most difficult things people do. One of the tools that can be used to help people escape the pleasure trap is fasting. Fasting is the complete abstinence of all substances except water in an environment of complete rest. Now, there's a lot of talk about fasting now, intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding. I just mentioned to you, time-restricted feeding is something we've advocated for the last 40 years. And that means basically don't eat 3 to 4 hours before we go to bed and go to bed at a reasonable hour. So it doesn't mean staying up till midnight and eating till midnight and staying up till 3. It means go to bed at a reasonable hour, subtract 3 to 4 hours, and don't eat in the last 3 to 4 hours. The benefit of that is you're not going to eat food that then gets converted into fat as easily. You're not going to be disrupting your sleep as a consequence of digestion, and it's going to help you avoid the overeating that happens at night because you're tired and angry and fatigued rather than actually hungry. You just ate dinner, you're not hungry. You're tired, bored, angry, whatever. You eat, you feel better. You make an error of attribution and decide you must have been hungry because now you feel better, when in actuality, it's just a stimulant. You might even delay breakfast in the morning if you're trying to lose weight, get some exercise in. You'll preferentially burn fat. It's going to give you a feeding window of between 8 and 12 hours. If you do that, it works really well for most people. But there's also a more extreme version of fasting, which is medically supervised water-only fasting. That's what we do at the True North Health Center. We've done it for 40 years. We've had 25,000 people walk in. And so far, 25,000 people walk out. And we're trying to make sure nobody screws up our safety data. So I want to be clear that we're talking about medically supervised water-only fasting here. The studies that we're going to be sharing with you, we've published 22 papers in the peer-reviewed literature, and this book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, summarizes our original research and other people's research to give you and your doctor the information you need to understand how to determine if a person's appropriate candidate for fasting, how to get through fasting safely and effectively, and what you can expect from it. There's a bunch of mechanisms by which fasting, which we're doing up to 40 days. So, patients get medical history, exam lab, monitor them twice a day. They'll be on water only, that's distilled water only, for up to 40 consecutive days. So it's not just Moses, David, Elijah, Jesus that fasted for 40 days. Our patients too, we tell them they're in good company. Most people think, can they really do that? Is that safe? I mean, most people think if you get on a plane here in New Jersey and you flew all the way to California, you'd die over Colorado if you didn't eat those pretzels. They think if they forgot the pretzels, there'd be like a bunch of people wouldn't make it. Turns out that's not true. Mechanisms. How is it fasting up to 40 days on water only could help people overcome problems, escape the pleasure trap, overcome heart disease, cancer, diabetes? How is that possible? What percentage of people do you think that go on water only fast lose weight? Well, that sounds quacky, doesn't it? Oh, the 100% effective health system. Yeah. But the laws of physics and thermodynamics say if you don't eat, you're going to lose weight. And that's true. You're going to lose about a pound a day. And as you're going to learn, if we have time, we're going to get to some of these studies. You're going to learn that visceral fat, that tumor-like substance on your abdomen, is preferentially mobilized during fasting. You also go through natriuresis, the selective elimination of sodium from the body. People eat too much salt. Salt's an essential nutrient without which you die, but you don't need to add salt to your food any more than you need to add sugar or maple syrup or oil to your food in order to be able to get the nutrients you need. The body selectively eliminates this sodium from the body, and it has a very powerful natriuretic effect, much more powerful than the hydrochlorothiazide your doctor might have tried to give you. And the fluid comes off, the blood volume goes down, the non-healing wound starts to heal, the congestive heart failure starts reversing. Detoxification. Are people really toxic? Like if we took a fat biopsy, would we find several hundred different chemicals in various concentrations like PCB, dioxin, pesticide residues, heavy metals? Would that really be in your body? You betcha. Various concentrations, different thresholds. And the body rapidly mobilizes and eliminates those materials during fasting. It can make it very entertaining. The skin rashes, the discharges, it can be very entertaining. But sometimes a little bit intense. But yes, it definitely happens. And some people say it happens so rapidly in fasting, you should never do fasting. Unless you take their proprietary products, then apparently it's perfectly safe. Okay, enzymatic induction. How do you think those toxins get out of your body? These are enzymatically driven processes. Enzymes grab onto them, pull them out. Enzymes also have to do macronutrient mobilization. For example, how do you think you break down fat? Lipolysis, enzymatically driven. Gluconeogenesis, break down your glycogen. Gluconeogenesis, break down the protein. So all of these are enzyme-driven systems, and those enzyme systems are induced during fasting. What else induces enzyme systems? How about exercise? Yeah. So that's why being a trained athlete, you get better and better at mobilizing glycogen stores. When you fast, you get better at mobilizing fat, protein, and detoxifying enzyme systems. And those systems persist after fasting. So it's not just while you're fasting. It's in the days, the weeks, the months after fasting, and it's cumulative. Every time you fast, just like every time you exercise, you get better and better at canalizing those pathways. Insulin is a hormone. It drives sugar from the bloodstream into the cells. If the insulin doesn't work because of insulin resistance, what happens to your blood sugar levels? And we call it diabetes mellitus. That's what diabetes is. Diabetics make more insulin than other people. They just don't use it. They can't use it. What causes insulin resistance? Technically, the diet that makes you fat. Like if you're fat, do you have to lose all the fat to get rid of the diabetes? No. And if insulin, blood sugars start dropping right away. You've got lots of fat left. It takes a while for the fat stores to go away. It's the diet that makes you fat. That's why the moment you change your diet, you often have to start modifying your medications because you're not being treated for your disease, you're treated for the diet that's causing the disease. The moment you change that disease, you have to start changing and eliminating the need for those medications. The gut is a tunnel. It starts in your mouth, and then into the stomach, like the feeding bag, I call it, and then there's the small intestine, and then the large intestine, and then there's the rectum, and then there's there's a hole at the end called the anus. So digestion is essentially shoving stuff in one hole, and then eventually trying to push it out the other. But nothing's getting in your body just because you swallow it. It has to be absorbed through the intestinal mucosa, and it has very fine mesh. Like proteins are too large to get through that. You can get amino acids absorbed unless there's some kind of inflammation, oxidative damage that causes that mesh to become bigger, and you get what's called gut leakage. The autonomic nervous system controls all the things that you don't think about. For example, if you went out running and your heart didn't speed up to pump more blood, you would die. Do people ever die because they forget to tell their heart to speed up? Does it ever forget? You ever see people out there like, no, come on. No, it does it automatically. It's controlled by the automatic or autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system has two parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic. They have to be in balance. If they're out of balance, you get problems. Like if your sympathetic nervous system is too high, you may have constipation because the autonomic nervous system controls peristalsis. If the parasympathetic is too high, you may have diarrhea. When the autonomic nervous system gets out of balance, you have pain, headaches, problems, all kinds of difficulties. We've come up with hundreds of healing systems to get that system back in balance. It's called massage, yoga, meditation, homeopathy, chiropractic manipulation, osteopathic manipulation, acupuncture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think those things make you feel better? To a large extent, to the degree they help rebalance the autonomic nervous system. The most powerful way of rebooting the autonomic nervous system is analogous to refreshing the memory in your computer. You know how when your computer stops working, you turn the thing off, you turn it back on, you don't know why, but now it's working again. You kind of rebooted it, all that. Well, that's kind of what fasting does. You shut everything down, you turn it back on, and lo and behold, do the Jews and the Jains and the Hindus and the Muslims and the Buddhists and the Christians all agree on everything? And not everything, but they do agree on one thing, and that all have a deep tradition for fasting. And it's because fasting changes how you feel about yourself and the world around you. The immune system is enhanced during fasting. It's not suppressed during fasting. Every objective measure of immune system function from leukocyte phagocytosis to on down tends to be enhanced. In fact, Yoshinori Oshumi won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2016 for his work on autophagy, or self-eating, how the body goes in there with the immune system, eats up the cancer cells and gets rid of the stuff. Well, there's one thing that profoundly influences and increases autophagy, and it turns out to be fasting. In fact, if you take rats, periodically underfeed them or rotationally fast them, you can double their lifespan. They'll live twice as long just by, in part, stimulating autophagy. When people are used to eating greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh, highly processed foods, do they like the taste of whole natural foods? Or is it disgusting, tasteless swill? Have you ever had any of your friends try to have a taste of your food and go, how can you eat that? It's disgusting. Because they're addicted to the pleasure trap. One of the things that fasting does, it reboots your palate, and good foods start to taste good. They say nothing tastes as good as healthy feels. I hope that's true. I always like to tell the story of the first. We became a fully covered medical benefit at the True North Health Center for California's largest labor union, International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 3. Big union. These guys build the highways, They approached us and said, hey, we want to make your program a covered benefit, so any member of the union with diabetes or hypertension can come to your clinic. And we said, yeah, that's great, I like that. And so they did. We went to a meeting, we presented our data, sent the first patient over, diabetic, hypertensive, 220/120, capped that on 5 medications, 75-pound keg on his belly. And they said, you can't work until you get your blood pressure down, go to this place, they'll help you. But they didn't tell him what the program was. So the guy shows up and he's looking around our place, True North Health Center, and he said, oh no. That's not for me. I'm in the wrong place. I said, no, you're not in the wrong place, your name's on the list. He says, yeah, that's not me. I said, no, you're here to get well. He goes, I'm not sick. I said, you are sick. He said, you got diabetes and hypertension. You're going to die. And he said, oh yeah? Aren't we all going to die? Valid point. And I thought, okay, different tact. I said, look, you're in $850 a month worth of medication. If we get you healthy, you won't need the drugs. He said, what do I care? I don't pay for the drugs. The union pays for the drugs. So I realized, either this is not my normal self-selected, highly motivated, long-standing, vegan, True North Health patient. But I don't want to strike out. I got a union contract, for God's sake. So I thought, okay, what do I know about this guy? Okay, diabetic, hypertensive. What do we know about men that are diabetic and hypertensive on a lot of drugs? So I said, if we get you healthy, we may be able to do something about your little problem. He stood up, and I'm thinking, uh-oh. Because I'm telling you, his neck's bigger than my thigh, you know what I'm saying? And he says, well, why the hell didn't you just say so? Guys, attention. So before we start fasting, one of the important things in fasting, you have to have good preparation. If you don't feed properly for a couple of days, you got problems. Like you live on, things like triple cheeseburgers, which he did. Only he ate triple cheeseburgers twice a day, but if they put the lettuce on there, that was a mistake. He'd take that off and throw that away because he didn't eat rabbit food. So we gave him some food from the True North Health, salad bar, hot bar. He's trying to eat, he can't eat the food. He's like, I'm thinking, oh my God, he's got an esophageal tumor. I sat down, I said, it looks like you're having trouble with the food. He said, what food? He said, this is not food. He said, this is disgusting. He said, if I had to eat tasteless swill like this, I'd rather just die. He said, you go out to my truck, you get my 12 gauge, and when I'm not looking, just shoot me in the head. So we checked him in. Fasted 26 days, he lost 50 pounds, got off his blood pressure, diabetes, all of his medication. After we're done fasting, he's sitting down and he's actually eating the food. And I sat down next to him. I said, looks like you're doing better with the food now. He said, yep, your damn chef's finally getting the hang of it. Took me 20 minutes to convince him it's the same food. When you came in, he goes, no, that stuff you gave me when I came in was disgusting. He said, this stuff's not bad. He wouldn't have complied for a day, not for a meal, if I sent him a little piece of paper and said, we'll go home and, But now, he's neuroadapted. I saw him 6 months later at a seminar, and we're doing blood pressure screening for the union. I said, how you doing? He said, I'm doing just fine. Fasting decreases a lot of things like glucose and insulin, IGF-1 and leptin. It lowers blood pressure, mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin, and that has impact on microbial loads. It impacts all kinds of different mechanisms that have been well studied. If you like this technical stuff, make sure you read our book. It's all there. And Dr. Myers, the co-author of the book, is actually really brilliant. She knows how to take complicated stuff and make it understandable. Fasting increases some stuff. You can see all kinds of different stuff here. One of the interesting things, I think, is it increases mitochondrial biogenesis, the actual energy-producing components within the cell itself. It increases BHB. BHB is the fuel your brain changes over. You're burning normally glucose. Your biggest burner of glucose is the brain. It shifts over to burning fat, particularly beta-hydroxybutyrate. The higher the BHB, the more BDNF you produce. BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's the chemical that protects your brain from Alzheimer's disease. So if you take rats, for example, which they've done, and these are genetically bred rats, exactly identical, everything's the same, except you give half the rats a wheel in the cage. The rats with the wheel in the cage will run on the wheel, they'll exercise, and they will not get Alzheimer's disease. And they said, why? Why did the exercise prevent Alzheimer's? It's because of the increase in BDNF protecting the brain. Exercise increases BDNF, so does fasting. It's interesting, almost everything that goes up with exercise also goes up with fasting, which is weird because in fasting you have to rest, exercise, you're vigorous. Why would these two completely unrelated activities have the same effect on biomarkers? What do fasting and exercise have in common? They both undo the consequence of dietary excess. They both get rid of the fat and the visceral fat. When you get rid of the visceral fat, you get rid of the inflammation. When you get rid of the inflammation, you get rid of the things that's causing the heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease. People don't recognize that. In our society, those conditions are treated as completely unrelated. You have to go to a different type of doctor to be even diagnosed and treated. You can't even go to the same doctor. And yet all those conditions, those leading contributing causes of death and disability, are all associated with excess fat, and particularly excess visceral fat. Combination of fasting and chemotherapy, according to Walter Longo in the Journal of Metabolism in 2015, result in dramatically higher cancer-free survival than chemotherapy alone. There's something called differential stress sensitization, differential stress sensitivity. In fasting state, which is a biological adaptation, human cells can adapt, but cancer cells can't. Cancer cells have high metabolic rates. They need a high glucose load. When you put them in a ketogenic environment, they can't compete as well with the immune system or with chemotherapy. Also, fasting tends to protect healthy cells from the damaging effects of chemotherapy. That's why when you combine the two together, you get dramatically higher outcomes. Is fasting safe? Can you actually take human beings, fast them for up to 40 days and do it safely? Well, we've done it 25,000 times in a row, and we've published the first long-term study in the BMC, Biomedical Central, on long-term fasting adverse events. We looked at all the adverse events based on the common terminology criteria for adverse events from the American Cancer Society. Every patient rated every symptom every day, put it into this study that's been published in the peer-reviewed literature, and every patient was given a rating for every symptom on the scale, 1 to 5. So 1 and 2 are these mild symptoms you expect in fasting: low back pain, headache, nausea, irritability, all that stuff. 3 and 4 are the more significant medical issues, like if your blood pressure is too high or your sodium is too low. And number 5 is the easiest to track, which is death. So we looked at all the patients. And of those 768 patients, there were 5,961 adverse events, most of which, of course, were category 1 and 2 events, as I said, the things you expect in fasting. The category 3 events, more medically significant, 9% of patients experienced. Most of those were hypertensive crises. That means any time your systolic blood pressure is over 160 would be considered a hypertensive crisis. Now you might ask, if you're treating hypertension with fasting, why would you have hypertensive crises in fasting? Here's how it works. Let's say you come in and your blood pressure is 220, and the next day it's 210, and the next day it's 200, and then it's 190, and then it's 180, and the next day it's 170. Every one of those days, adverse event. So it doesn't matter if it's coming down, it doesn't matter if it's causally related, it's just an arbitrary standard. If your blood pressure is over a certain level, that category, that symptom, that gets, in fact, 95% of those category 3 events are just that. People who have high blood pressure and it's coming down, normalizing its way. It's only 1/10 of 1%, 1 per thousand, but this was a hyponatremic case. Person's sodium went too low. Fortunately, not a problem. Why? Because we're monitoring it, and if it goes too low, what do? You break the fast, they're fine. But if you weren't monitoring it, that could certainly become a serious or life-threatening problem, and no deaths. So we've had all those people walk in so far, everybody's survived. Conclusion, fasting is a safe and effective experience if it's done according to protocol. But that means history exam, lab to make sure you're a good candidate for fasting, that you rest during fasting and hydrate to avoid dehydration, and that you refeed carefully to avoid post-fasting edema or potentially life-threatening refeeding syndrome, which we've never seen because we use the protocol. So relative contraindications to fasting, you can see the list here if you're pregnant or lactating, if you've recently had a PE or heart attack and you're on anticoagulant therapy, if you have a type 1 diabetes, if you have the inability to adapt to fasting, fasting may not be for you. We can sometimes do modified fasting, juice fast, refeeding programs. You can go on a healthy diet. But not everybody's a good candidate for water-only fasting. We want to make sure that everybody walks in, walks out, and that's why history, exam, and lab are necessary to determine whether a person's a good candidate, establish a baseline to be able to monitor them appropriately. Conditions that are favorable to fasting, not rocket science, conditions associated with dietary excess. So if being overweight, having fat and visceral fat contributes to the problem, it's likely fasting may be for you. Overweight, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, depression, anxiety, autoimmune diseases, and certain forms of cancer like lymphoma respond remarkably well and often very predictably. People fast from anywhere from 2 to 40 days. Sometimes it takes multiple fasts depending on the condition. So this was a case, our first case in the British Medical Journal actually. First case they've ever published on anything like this, I'll guarantee you that. But this was a woman who'd had a 2-year history of follicular lymphoma. It's a type of cancer. She had lesions in upper and lower extremities. It was called class 3. It was confirmed by excisional biopsy. She'd had 2-year tracking and it had been getting worse. The one thing that all her doctors agreed on is that diet didn't matter, that she could eat whatever she wanted. Diet wasn't related to follicular lymphoma. And when she saw the oncologist, they said that fasting, when she asked about it, was criminal quackery. So given that tremendous medical encouragement and support, she decided to come to the True North Health Center, underwent 21 days of fasting, during which time her tumors disappeared. We fasted for 3 weeks. We refed her for 10 days, sent her back to the oncologist with strict instructions to get a follow-up CT scan. And also warning that they may give her a little trouble about getting that scan. But anyway, she went back to the oncologist, and she said he examined her. And then he examined her some more, and then she was looking at the chart, and he looked at her, and he looked at the picture, and then he said, "What happened?" And she said, "I went to the criminal quacks and did the fasting, and the tumors all went away." And he said, "Oh my." And she said, "And I'd like a CT scan." And she said, "Oh, you don't need a CT scan." She goes, "No, but I want a CT scan because I want to objectify the changes." He says, "You don't need to objectify the changes. I've been doing this for 25 years. You're better now." And she said, I don't know where she got this idea, but she said, what if there's cancer lurking just beneath the surface? Got the CT scan. He said her white count was a little low. Maybe she could take some gentle chemotherapy. He said, maybe we won't do that. Followed her at 3 months and 6 months and then a year. Got pre and post CTs. White count normalized. Then we submitted this to the British Medical Journal. And at first they gave us some trouble. They said, well, maybe she just got lucky. And so they said, okay, we're going to publish this paper, but you need to track her for 3 years. Because when you treat medically, sometimes the tumors go down too, but then they come back and it's a mess and doesn't really affect all-cause mortality. And we went ahead and tracked her carefully. I told her she had to stick strictly to the whole plant food diet or it could be fatal, because I would track her down and kill her. She believed me. We were able to follow her at 3 years. She was completely cancer-free. And we resubmitted that to British Medical Journal. At first, they rejected the article that they invited us to submit. And then we appealed, and they actually did finally print it. And then we followed her at 10 years. So 10 years, completely cancer-free. But she also went public with her story, and we started getting lots of lymphoma patients being referred. And we've treated dozens of them. And we have just published last month a series of these lymphoma patients that have undergone fasting. We got one who was a problem because he had failed chemotherapy. So he had chemotherapy, tumors went down for a while, they came back worse than ever. And then we thought, well, will it still work even after they've been through the ravages of chemotherapy? We fasted him, and sure enough, he did really well too, 21 days of fasting. We got long-term follow-up in him. We have also a third patient. This was a gentleman who had metastasis into the bones, and, it's quite advanced, and he underwent 21 days of fasting. His oncologist was a bit skeptical, but he came in and fasted anyway, went back to the oncologist, showed him this, and then the oncologist said, well, yeah, maybe you should do some more of that. So he came back and ended up going from here to here to here. Actually, there's new data. It's even better. He's doing great. So now we have this case series that's been submitted. The next thing, of course, will be a clinical trial. That's what we're hoping to do, or random assignment, and do the whole bit and really piss some people off. There's benign lesions that fall off during fasting. It happens pretty frequently. This is a facial lesion. Person didn't come in for this. They came in for their blood pressure and whatnot, which, of course, responded remarkably well, as you can see. But also their facial lesion fell off, so they didn't have to have surgery, so that was kind of fun. We did a study on body composition. We took a DEXA scanner and we carefully analyzed what whole body composition. We showed that not only do people lose weight in fasting, but we know exactly what their components are. And it turns out in this group of patients, they lost 8.7% of their entire weight. This is a couple weeks of fasting. But they lost 17.8% of all of the fat on their body. But shockingly, they lost almost 40% of all their visceral fat. So the visceral fat was preferentially mobilized. They lost 6.1% of lean tissue, but by the end of 6-week follow-up, all of that lean tissue was back and then some. As a percentage of their body mass, their lean mass was actually higher at follow-up than it was at baseline. You lose weight during fasting, then you gain weight refeeding, but the weight you gain after fasting is water, fiber, glycogen, and protein. And what you lose is fat, and the fat loss continues even as you're regaining scale weight. So we also said, what about in normal people? Can you fast healthy people? Would they get any benefit? This was really hard. We wanted to find metabolically healthy people. It turns out there's not very many of them out there. So they come in, maybe they're not overweight, but their blood pressure is too high, or their blood sugars, they don't qualify as healthy. We finally had to resort to recruiting staff that work at the True North Health Center. Literally, that's where we finally got enough numbers for the study. It was just getting some of our staff people who live and eat and work. It turns out they qualified. So we fasted them, and it turns out as much benefit as sick people get from fasting, proportionally, healthy people had more changes in cardiometabolic risk factors than even sick people. So even though they started off at decent weight, they ended up even better. Even though they started off with normal blood pressure, the blood pressure was even better. They're starting off an average of 110. That's not a problem, but 106 is better. So 4% reduction in all-cause mortality. For every point systolic blood pressure drops closer to 90, there's a 1% reduction in all-cause mortality. And so healthy people do well fasting, and we believe that people get the most benefit may very well be the healthiest people that use it preventatively, which is what we advocate, is that healthy people fast for a week a year in a restful setting. And if you do okay at the end of a week, then you're done. If not, we keep going however long it takes to get the job done. Retroperitoneal mass. This was great. This is a person who adopted a vegan diet, but about 6 months later developed abdominal pain. And her friends were so thrilled. It must be the diet. It's that vegan, eat some meat. But her doctors did some scans and they found out she actually had a mass. And they couldn't tell if it was a cancerous mass or a fibrotic mass. It was in a delicate place. The guy that was going to go there and poke a hole in it had about a month. So we said, well, why don't we try fasting first to see if we can get the mass to go down. We did. Fasted 13 days, 11 days of refeeding. Obviously, she lost some weight, got a reduction in blood pressure, almost 40 points, pretty good start. And the mass reduced so much there was nothing left to biopsy. Yeah, I enjoyed that one. Turned out it wasn't the vegan diet after all. A dentist went to an event just like this, in a tent just like this. And there was some wind and the pole came down and hit her in the head. And she got, as you can imagine, a headache, but the headache never went away. She ended up with a dural tear. She had for 16 years constant daily head pain, 8 out of 10 to 10 out of 10 pain every day, every moment of being awake. For 16 years, she became disabled. She wasn't able to work. She tried all the medications. It didn't work. Desperation, she called me. She said she wants to fast. We brought her in. To make a long story short, she fasted for 41 days, during which time she had no relief for the first 19 days. 19 days, she woke up 5 minutes, first time in 16 years, no pain. Didn't even know what it felt like. She was took her a while to realize what went on. Pain came back, progressively got better. By the end of 40 days, I said, look, that's it, we got to stop. She goes, no, I have to do one more day. I said, no, we only fast up to 40 days. I said, no, I got to do one more day. I said, why is that? She said, the men fast for 40 days. Moses, David, Elijah, Jesus. Said, women always have to do just a little more. Did the 41st day, broke the fast. She was largely out of pain, did pretty low, but still was getting some prodrome. We refed her for 6 months, and then we fasted her again for 40 more days. Second 40-day fast, after which she had no head pain. And now we have 5-year, 10-year. We've published this outcome. She's doing great. Those were other changes that occurred in this woman. Severe plaque psoriasis. This gentleman was 47 years old. He had had 28 years of problems with plaque psoriasis. You've seen this condition before, I'm sure. On the left, underwent 13 days of fasting, eliminated all the steroids, all medication, and then a 2-month follow-up. Can you tell the difference? He could. They say plaque psoriasis is not diet-related. Those same people that tell you that, they're also telling you none of their patients ever get well. I don't know why. Maybe there's a correlation. High blood pressure, the leading contributing cause of death and disability in the United States. We have the largest effect that's ever been shown in treating human beings with high blood pressure. A study we did with T. Colin Campbell at our center, 174 consecutive patients, 174 people achieved blood pressure enough to eliminate medication with an average effect size in stage 3 hypertension of 60 points. There's nothing that works as well as nothing to treat high blood pressure. Essentially, everybody with essential hypertension, if you fast long enough, gets well. The problem is you have to do dangerous and radical things to keep it well. You have to eat well, exercise, and go to bed on time. Because fasting is not a cure, it's a management strategy. Once you get well, you have to stay well, and you have to stay well with healthful living. We also treated borderline hypertension, people not high enough to justify the risk of medication. Do you understand the blood pressure medications that are given to treat high blood pressure have a mortality associated with them? They will kill a certain amount of people. They will also cause chronic fatigue and impotence and all kinds of secondary problems. Why don't they give everybody hypertensive meds since 62% of people over 60 have hypertension? Because you kill more people than you would save unless you only give it to the people with the highest levels of hypertension. High blood pressure medications will not reduce your risk of heart attack. They will reduce your risk of stroke. So you have to wait until the risk of stroke is so high that the death risk from the drugs are offset by the saved risk from the stroke reduction. Or you can get healthy. We also did a study with our colleague from the Mayo Clinic. This was a prospective study. 27 people completed the study. 26 people had normal blood pressure without medication. One person required 50% of their original dosing. And then we followed those people for a year because we wanted to know what would happen after a year. Could they maintain their weight loss? So what do you think? Did these people maintain their weight loss when they went home a year later? Turns out 76% of those people maintained their weight loss. Were they all perfect? No. Some of them even occasionally had some maple syrup. But they maintained their weight loss, and the majority of them maintained normal blood pressure without any medication. Dr. Lyle, our psychologist, predicted it would be 5%. He said the literature is clear, 1 in 20 people can make significant behavioral changes last over the long term. I said a third of them would do it. I was wrong. It was almost 2/3, which means I was wrong, but he was more wrong. Which means I win. So you'll notice that median BMI, and then look at a year later, BMI is actually lower. Body weight, their body weight, you'll notice, was actually slightly lower than it was at the end of the fast. So not only did they maintain all the net weight loss, but then some. Were they all perfect? No. But they were good enough. And it does show you highly motivated people are capable of making fundamental diet and lifestyle changes. This is median blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, medication usage. Again, the vast majority of people are able to eliminate the use of medications, and along with them, the chronic cough, the nausea, and all the other stuff. Look at abdominal circumference. So they weren't all completely compliant, but look at how big their bellies were, because they're preferentially mobilizing visceral fat. COVID. So COVID, some people get COVID, a significant percentage, some say 10%, and don't recover. And so they get brain fog and fatigue and joint pain, and then it's a big mess. Some people get the vaccine, and then they get severe reactions to the vaccine. Much higher percentage than you might believe. Especially healthcare workers are getting repeat exposures. We got like a hospital that we're just... Anyway, the point is we've published the first case of effective treatment of long COVID with water-only fasting. This paper has now just appeared. And a 73-year-old man had a 2-year history of hell secondary to COVID that he didn't recover, underwent fasting with us, and did remarkably well. Interestingly enough, he then went and got COVID. He contracted it from the field, got a flare-up, came back in, did another 10-day fast, got a resolution, and there's his long-term follow-up. Complete resolution of the brain fog and all the stuff he'd had for 2 years before. Again, fasting nor vaccination will not keep you from getting COVID. The difference is fasting can actually help you recover if you're not recovering quickly enough. And interestingly enough, lipoprotein(a), a very sensitive marker for cardiovascular risk, Medicare only pays for one test because they don't think you can change it. There's no drug that'll change it. It's thought to be untreatable. It's just you're genetically vulnerable, tough luck. We took this patient. This is a very famous long-term vegan who'd eaten a little bit of too much maple syrup, gained a little bit of weight, increased his blood pressure. So he came in to fast. He fasted for 10 days, and you can see his numbers. He dropped his weight 10 pounds. He dropped his blood pressure back to normal from 145 to 106. But what was most exciting is his lipoprotein(a) that was dangerously high and thought to be untreatable, reduced by 40% after 10 days of fasting. And now we've gotten sustained results. And this case is actually also going to be appearing in the scientific literature this month. So bottom line is, fasting is really amazing, both for healthy people and sick people. If you're going to do it right. If you want to understand fasting, read the book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? You won't be disappointed. It's a great book. If you're interested in more information, you can go to our website, truenorthhealth.com. We offer a free phone conversation with me. If you want to know, is this something that might be useful to you or somebody, fill out the registration forms. I'll review your medical history. I'll talk to you. It doesn't cost you anything. Point you in the right direction. We live stream our lectures at the center. You're welcome to join us for that. You just go to our website. We're not monetizing anything, so you can get access to all of our educational materials. We have vegan. Ramses was here, our chef was here, I think, last year. He's a great chef. Yeah, isn't he great? And he has 2 cookbooks. They're vegan, SOS free. And like even I can make the stuff in his cookbook. You don't have to be a gourmet chef to make it turn out good. So that's good. And those are our 2 books. And I have about 50 seconds left. So I'm going to try to open up to questions that you might have.
We have one question that's going to preempt that question.
Okay.
Our host, Dr. Weiss, has to.
The Connerys are part of our ethos family. And their 15-year-old Ellie was just diagnosed last week with type 1 diabetes and was hospitalized. And she is in the honeymoon period. Maybe you can explain what that means to the audience.
Yeah. So there's a period of time where the islet cells in the pancreas that produce insulin have been destroyed. There's 2 common causes of destruction for islet cells. Number one is you can get a virus. It's just a really unfortunate bad luck. But you can also, for people exposed to dairy proteins, for people that are exposed to cow proteins, the genetically vulnerable people's immune system will react and destroy their islets later. And that's why you see dramatically lower type 1 incidences in people that have not been exposed to dairy proteins. Even I think the American Pediatric Association says the first couple of years don't use unopposed milk because they know that this is a risk factor. But sometimes people get viruses. The viruses can impact the islet cells. Then your insulin production level goes down, and this is a really serious problem because you've got to have insulin to survive. And so type 1 diabetes, unlike the majority of diabetics, type 2 diabetics, which make plenty of insulin, they have insulin resistance, you fast them, they get better. Type 1 is a much more complicated situation. The good news is that even in type 1 diabetics that ultimately end up needing some insulin replacement because they're not making enough insulin, exquisite diet and lifestyle control and healthy lifestyle control result in very stable blood sugar levels on minimal levels of replacement therapy, and long-term outcomes are great. I've got some really old type 1 diabetics that have done great because they've been willing to really aggressively control diet and lifestyle. So it just makes it all the more important to do this, but it's not something that you fix necessarily because of, say, fasting or something like that. So it's really about diet, sleep, exercise, and there's not a lot of room. And in a way, they make good patients because they really can't get away with anything because their body tells them, right away. Now with the monitoring tools that are available, it's pretty obvious to see what works and what doesn't work.
We wanted to know if you've ever fasted anyone in the honeymoon period.
You can fast in the honeymoon period, but I wouldn't expect that to resolve the problem. So I really focus on the diet and lifestyle stuff. I can tell you this, of the few patients that we've had significant medical complications on, most of them have been insulin-dependent diabetics that we've tried to do heroic intervention in. So it's like really tricky, okay? Because insulin is a critical part of adapting to the fasting process. So, we can talk about it, but it's an unusual circumstance. Generally, we say we don't do that, but
with the plant-based lifestyle, what about the sugar from like fruit and dates? How does that affect the diabetics, and can they do that? So
remember, dates are like, if you were to go out on a date, would you have 10 dates or would you go on 1 date? I mean, some people might go on multiple dates, but you can get into trouble. So dates, if you're going to use a date, it's a date. And for some diabetics, we have to actually restrict fruit intake until their blood sugar levels are stabilized. And the reason is the fruits that we eat today, wonderful as they are hybridized high sugar balls that are very low in fiber. They don't look like wild fruit. If you go to Hawaii and get the wild apples, they're more like vegetables. So the diet of diabetics in our patient are vegetable dominated. And then we add as much fruit as that individual can actually tolerate. And it's going to be whole fruit. It's not going to be dried fruit. It's not going to be fruit juices. It's not going to be maple syrup. It's not going to be any kind of fractionated food factors. Those things, for a person that doesn't have those restrictions, might be able to have a little more flexibility. They might even have 2 dates. But for diabetics, we're pretty restrictive on that until such time as insulin resistance is resolved.
When somebody's doing a fast, or especially at the True North Center, what do you do all day? Like,
So-
are you resting? Are you working? Or,
Right.
you know?
So some of it depends on, are we fasting for 40 days or 4 days? You know, it's a healthy person, a sicker person. But the way the model works is the first thing in the morning, the doctors come around, they take your vitals and make sure you're still alive, answer your questions. Then we have a class at 10:30, at 2, and then at 6:30. We have a lot of video education. We call it education. It's really brainwashing, but you know. And then they have cooking classes, they have Tai Chi, they have yoga, meditation. People are there. You have 70, 75 people from around the world kind of interacting. We have a courtyard. So there's that kind of activity that goes on. And then in the afternoon, the doctors come around again, get the vitals, measure things, make sure everything's still going okay. And that goes on day after day until you're feeding. And then, of course, it's a little bit more fun, and there's exercise and fitness. We have chiropractors, massage therapists, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you're adapting to the fast. For people that are energetic, like I have one guy, he only works when he's here fasting. He writes a screenplay once a year during fasting because he works better fasting. If I could just get him to live healthy the rest of the time of the year. But anyway, so the point is, some people, they might do some remote work. You know, we got the fiber optic and the bandwidth and all that kind of stuff set up so people can do what they need to do. Rest is the best, and you know, depending on the person, we try to adapt to their needs. But people are amazingly alert and focused during fasting. Some of them actually, you think if they haven't eaten for 3 weeks, they come to meals and talk to people and socialize. They look at what's for, you know. But you're not hungry because you're in ketosis and there's a hunger blunting mechanism, and you know. So their people are pretty engaged though. They all think they're going to catch up on all their reading and all that stuff, but usually they get so engaged socially and stuff that, you know, they don't always have time to do all the stuff that they thought they were going to do.
Thank you, Dr. Goldhamer.